Before we get started, I have a quick favor. I've been self-funding the Finding Genius podcast for 5 years now. I've done over 3,000 episodes. And as you can see on YouTube, we're up over 1 million views on the channel, which is fantastic. The next thing I really want to push on is to get up to 10,000 subscribers. Because once we do, we'll be able to put a donate button and we'll be able to solicit donations to help keep the podcast running and to also get the Finding Genius Foundation moving along. We have a big project studying anxiety, depression, and PTSD and working on a product to help people overcome these problems because I've seen them explode recently after the last 2 years of the whole virus situation. So if you would, please subscribe to the podcast. That would help us tremendously. Give us a thumbs up and check in the description for Buy Me a Coffee. It's about $5. If you could buy me a coffee, I'd really appreciate it. It would help keep the channel going, and I love coffee. Thank you.
Forget frequently asked questions.
Common sense, common knowledge, or Google.
How about advice from a real genius? 95% of people in any profession are good enough to be qualified and licensed. 5%
Go above and beyond.
they become very good at what they do, but only
0.1%.
are real geniuses. Richard Jacobs has made it his life's mission to find them for you. He hunts down and interviews geniuses in every field: sleep science, cancer, stem cells, ketogenic diets, and more. Here come the geniuses. This is the Finding Genius Podcast
With Richard Jacobs.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Finding Genius Podcast. My guest today is Vito Buonsante. He's an environmental lawyer, technical and policy advisor at IPEN, the International Pollutants Elimination Network. Website is IPEN.org. We're going to talk about various issues and policy issues surrounding plastics and pesticides and chemicals, and we'll make our way around those issues. So welcome, Vito. Thank you for coming.
Hi, Richard. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Tell me a little bit about your background. What led you to work at IPEN and to care about policies surrounding, pesticides, chemicals, plastics, etc.?
Oh, that's a great question. I hope my answer is not too long. Yeah, I studied law, and my main initial interest, I studied international law, and my main interest was to get into human rights law. I thought I was kind of a idealist, and indeed, I moved to Hungary for professional reasons, and actually mainly initially for personal reasons. And then I got there into a profession, and I started to work on various human rights issues. And one that I encountered was understanding what are the impacts of the environment surrounding on human health and also on the enjoyment on one's human rights. And that sparked my interest, particularly on waste issues and on chemicals issues. And then that brought me on to work on chemicals, but the initial hook was to work on the rights of people that lived near landfills, near industrial facilities, and how we can protect them better by using human rights.
Any interesting projects you're working on that focus maybe on a particular geographic area and the impact of various pollutants on the people in that area? Anything that comes to mind?
Yeah, I mean, at the time I was younger, and I was working with a group called the European Roma Rights Center. So they were specifically protecting this minority, the Roma people that are mainly located in Central Europe. Some of these...
they call them the gypsies, right?
They call them gypsies, but I don't think that the way they like to be called in general.
Right, I think the formal name is the Roma people, right?
Exactly.
Okay, gotcha, go ahead.
And so that, they are a particularly discriminated minority, particularly in countries in Central Europe. They are discriminated a bit everywhere, but they're much more, especially after the end of the fall of the Iron Curtain. And so we would make research about how to protect them better, especially when they're nomads, how to ensure that they would be placed in better location, in more cleaner locations. And that led me with a university professor at the Central European University in Budapest to start to get interested in the Aarhus Convention, which is a convention that looks at access to information, public participation, and access to justice. And that was my first step into the world of environment and law. And then after that, I found another program, actually that was a sort of an international organization called the Regional Environmental Center for Central and Eastern Europe, also based near Budapest, where we helped countries updating their laws in order to enter into the European Union, because there's a process to enter the European Union.
Well, I just wanted to talk about, if you don't mind, have you worked directly with certain communities that have been impacted by pollution that either they created or they happen to live nearby and they just couldn't get away, that they were affected by it? Do you have any examples of that?
Most of my work has always been desk work. In the various organizations that I worked with, there were people that worked directly with the community and trying to organize the communities. But my job has been purely using the law, trying to create the good legal arguments in order to enforce this law. So that my main expertise has been a bit less exciting from an activist point of view, but more
okay.
On the legal side. Yeah.
No, you must get reports then from the field of people that do work directly with different communities, because that would shape the law policy that you help to create or alter. What's an example of a law in a country maybe that had, unintended side effects, either in a good or bad way on the people there or on adjacent areas?
Yeah, I mean, rather than a law, I remember one project that I worked with that was about a mining project in Romania, where I was given a permission to a big international company to do mining, and basically this community was either going to be displaced, and those that were not going to be displaced would be potentially affected by the negative impact of mining because of all the emissions, because of the tailing ponds that, can, when there's rain, if they're not well contained, they can cause harm to the surrounding community. Especially, what happens very often with environmental law is that it's not much around the consequences of laws, but we often have lacks of protections for populations, and due to environmental law is quite weak in most countries. If you think about it, the U.S. has a relatively strong environmental law that comes mainly from laws that were passed in the 70s up to the beginning of the 90s with the amendment to the Clean Air Act.
Clean water, clean air, that kind of stuff, right?
Yeah. So that's quite unprecedented. So you have them in the US, you have them in Canada with SEPA, you have them in the EU with various regulation directives. But if you look at most of the rest of the world, no country really has this strong regulations to protect the environment and the people. Because in the end, when we think about environmental law, what we're thinking about is really protecting the people and keeping a healthy environment around them.
So, what's an example that just made you proud or happy of your involvement? You felt like you accomplished something good by, changing the policy or the law, or, finding a loophole and closing it, in a given country or given area?
Yeah, I'll give you a couple of them. And, it may not sound too exciting, but fast forward a few years later, when I had moved to Brussels, I was working as an attorney in an environmental organization based in Brussels and London called Client Earth, which is still very active. And it's a sort of Earth Justice or NRDC for Europe. And so there I would work on legal cases. And so one of them was about making available the name of the producers of chemicals. And that, it seems like a small thing, but it created a sort of a legal battle between my organization and the European Chemical Agency and the European Commission and the industry, because they absolutely didn't want, because there was an inventory of all companies that produce chemicals over a certain amount. It's a European regulation called REACH. And I was using exactly the Paris Convention, one of these international treaties, to argue that the name and the quantities of the chemicals that are placed on the market need to be made available. It turned into a legal battle, and finally we won, my case went through, and now all that data is available. So it is possible to go on a public website to check which company is putting which chemical on the market. And so that creates a sort of accountability, which company is selling a specific poison, and they cannot hide anymore behind secrecy. So that's something I'm quite proud of.
So what happens when you have strong environmental laws in some countries and weak ones in others? Is that where you see the exportation of, electronics disposal, let's say to China, because they don't have, or they didn't have, much law around taking this waste, or to India, or like what happens with, environmental waste, for instance?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of imbalances. I mean, to be frank, environmental law is still, even in places where the environmental law is relatively strong, is still likely to be less enforced than other laws. So we shouldn't feel too safe, not even in the US or in Europe. But definitely, like industries are gonna use any loophole to save money and try to dump their wastes or their toxics in other countries. That is the unfortunate truth that leads to, for example, China until a few years ago when they decided to stop to receive basically most of the plastic waste in the world, which brings us to the plastic issues. Like we grew up in the last 40 years since the beginning of the 80s with the idea that plastic is like a great material, is a miracle material, and despite like this huge amount of plastics, like we thought that we would magically recycle it all, but what was happening? We were only sending it to other countries that really didn't know what to do. This is not to say that plastic don't get recycled at all. They get recycled, but very, very few get recycled, and the rest ends up poisoning a lot of communities. So that's a bit to the consequence of weak laws. When it comes to chemicals specifically, we know that there's hundreds of thousands of chemicals that are on the market, and over 15,000 are on the market in quite medium or high quantities. So do you imagine what does it mean for a small government having to control all those chemicals, like having to test them, having to check the studies? It's a kind of like a capacity that very few countries have. And obviously that becomes a weakness particularly for low and middle income countries. So on the one hand, you have like the lack of environmental law or weaker environmental laws. But sometimes even if you have them, the task is so overwhelming that they become very vulnerable.
Before we continue, I've been personally funding the Finding Genius podcast for 4.5 years now, which has led to 2,700 plus interviews of clinicians, researchers, scientists, CEOs, and other amazing people who are working to advance science and improve our lives and our world. Even though this podcast gets 100,000 plus downloads a month, we need your help to reach hundreds of thousands more worldwide. Please visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click on Support Us. We have 3 levels of membership from $10 to $49 a month, including perks such as the ability to see ahead in our interview calendar and ask questions of upcoming guests, transcripts of podcasts you're interested in, the ability to request specific topics or guests, and more. Visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click Support Us today. Now back to the show.
Good. Right now, what can you disclose? What kind of legislation are you working on, and how is it going to affect its constituent countries or areas?
Well, right now, one of the main policies I'm working on is the development of the Plastics Treaty. So basically, at the beginning of 2022, in what is called the United Nations Environment Assembly, there was a decision by all governments to start negotiation for a new treaty, more or less like the Paris Agreement. But in this case, for plastics, like Paris Agreement is for climate, and this would be for plastic. And the idea of this agreement would be to end the plastic pollution throughout its life cycle. So looking at all aspects of it, from production until disposal. And the idea was to finish this treaty negotiation by the end of 2024. Meaning that by the end of this year, so in November of this year, there will be the 5th negotiating committee that would get together. However, I must say that the task appears to be much more difficult than what it was thought. So the goal would be really to control plastic pollution, but countries have very, very different views on how to do it. Something obvious, as scientists tell us, would be to reduce the production and to eliminate many of the toxic chemicals that are related to plastics, because few people, when they think about plastic, think about toxic chemicals, but the reality is that plastics are made of chemicals. So right now,
What about the awareness now of microplastics? How is that changing the picture in the law?
Microplastics is definitely... There has been many issues at the same time that have brought more awareness around plastic, and definitely the understanding of the trillions of pieces of plastics that are already in the environment and the fact that plastic break down all the time has increased that awareness. And the fact that, you know, we find out more and more that plastics is in our blood, plastics are in are pretty much microplastics are pretty much everywhere in the water we drink, in high mountains, like even in Nepal and on the Everest, and you can find microplastics. And so this creates an even bigger and scarier layer to it. But why are they problematic? It's also because of what they're made of. The fact that those plastics are made often or contain toxic chemicals make them even more dangerous.
Yeah, and one plastic item can fragment, I would guess, into millions of little pieces of plastic. So all the plasticizers and other chemicals that are in, whatever plastic item it is, now they're spread all over the place. So it seems like it could wreak havoc if enough plastics were damaged and then spread everywhere.
Yes, and in fact, when the attention of the international communities goes towards a policy issue like this one, and in the case of plastics, then obviously there is an increase in research, and we keep on finding out more and more things. And one of the things that scientists have found is that these pieces of plastic become vectors even for chemicals that often they may degrade immediately in the environment, but because they are attached to plastics, they basically transform the threat. So a chemical, let's say bisphenol A, which is a toxic chemical, we all know it's toxic, is dangerous, but when it attaches to a piece of plastic, it doesn't degrade at the same speed, and it just is transported in the water, and it may end up again in the Arctic or wherever in the world, and so that makes it even more scary. And very difficult to control, because if you think about microplastics, there is really no way to clean the water, clean the air from microplastics. It's really, there are way too many, and so the only way is either to stop them or to make different plastics, to make plastic that actually biodegrade. But what we know so far is that no plastic really biodegrades, or it may take hundreds of years. They may take hundreds of years to biodegrade.
Yeah, we don't even know, because it hasn't been hundreds of years that plastics have been around. So when they say it'll take 500 years or 1,000 years, there's no way they could know. It's just that's a modeled assumption.
Exactly. And then, we then get confronted with the issue of production, and then that's where it becomes even more complicated, because we get within the picture more and more the fossil fuel industry and the petrochemical industry, because as we move forward with policies that try to contain climate change and the increase of temperature, it is clearer and clearer that we will have to stop burning fossil fuels. So what is going to happen with those fossil fuels? There's many companies and even countries whose economy completely depend on the extraction and the exploitation of fossil fuels. So one alternative plan is, instead of burning them as fuels, is to use them to create materials, and those materials are plastics. So the prediction is that if we don't have a strong treaty that curtails productions, detoxifies the way we make plastics, is that by 2060 we will triple our production of plastics from the level of 2019. And so if we think about, even already now, we think about, wow, there's so much plastics, that this amount of plastics will quadruple in a little amount of time, because we will produce 3 times as much only in the next 25, 30 years.
Well, very good. Well, Vito, where can people find out more about the policy work that you're involved in? Where can they go to learn about all the initiatives and the progress of them? Is there a central repository?
Well, the United Nations Environment Program is one of those, is the main UN agency that deals with this, but talks about the plastic. So that could be one, but I would suggest coming to the IPEN website. Our organization is an organization that mainly has as a goal to support small NGOs in developing countries and lower and medium income countries to participate to these negotiations and to so that their voice can be heard. And we also create science and some of the things that you can find in our as resources in our website is all sorts of like materials around plastic pollution, about plastic production, and especially about the toxic impact of plastic. So some resources that I would suggest is IPEN, but I would also suggest looking at the scientists. Some scientists have done an amazing job in making their work much more accessible, and we have contributed to that work. For example, the Endocrine Society, which is an association of doctors, one of the eldest medical association of doctors, are participating actively to the work of in this treaty work, and they have created resources around specifically some of the most toxic groups of chemicals that are used in plastic production, and being alert to them is both scary but also something important to know about, because a lot of these chemicals that are used in plastic have impacts that are they include cancer, they include neurodevelopmental disorders, and a lot of reproductive disorders.
Well, very good. Vito, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having me.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
You've been listening to the Finding Genius podcast with Richard Jacobs. If you like what you hear, be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at findinggeniuspodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed.